The sun was setting over the city skyline as Police Captain Williams gathered her belongings from her desk at the 15th Precinct. The worn leather chair creaked as she stood up, her bones aching from another marathon shift that had stretched well beyond its scheduled end. The precinct buzzed with the usual evening activity, phones ringing, officers chatting, and the constant hum of computers and fluorescent lights that had become the soundtrack to her 15-year career. She glanced at the family photo on her desk, a reminder of why she'd chosen this path. Her daughter's graduation picture sat next to her own academy graduation photo from years ago. The contrast between the fresh-faced rookie and the seasoned captain she'd become always brought a slight smile to her face. The journey hadn't been easy, especially as a black woman in law enforcement, but her grandmother's words always echoed in her mind. Change happens from the inside. The captain's office, with its glass walls and strategic view of the bullpen, had been her home for the past 3 years. Tonight, like many nights before, she was the last ranking officer to leave. She'd spent the evening reviewing incident reports and finalizing next month's patrol schedules, the kind of mundane but crucial tasks that kept the precinct running smoothly. Heading out, Cap. Officer Chen called from his desk, where he was finishing up his own paperwork. He'd been on the force for just 2 years, but his dedication reminded her of herself at that age. Finally, she replied, adjusting her civilian jacket over her holstered service weapon, "Don't stay too late with Self Chen. Your daughter's recital is tomorrow, right?" His face lit up at the mention. "You remembered?" "Yes, ma'am. Just wrapping up this report." This was why she loved her job, these small moments, the family they'd built within these walls. Every officer, every staff member knew that Captain Williams kept track of their lives, their families, their struggles and triumphs. It wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about building a community. As she walked through the precinct, she exchanged quick goodbyes with the evening shift officers coming in. The familiar faces, the casual salutes, the respectful good nights. It was all part of the routine she'd grown to appreciate. She'd worked hard to create an atmosphere of mutual respect in the precinct, breaking down the rigid hierarchies that often made police work feel impersonal. The parking lot was quieter now, with just a few patrol cars coming and going. Her personal vehicle, a modest black SUV, sat in its usual spot. She'd bought it last year after her old sedan finally gave up the ghost. The SUV wasn't flashy, that wasn't her style, but it was reliable and practical, just like her approach to police work. As she settled into the driver's seat, she noticed the small Street Michael medallion hanging from her rearview mirror, a gift from her mother when she first joined the force. Next to it dangled a small rainbow pride flag, a gesture of solidarity with her LGBTQ+ officers that had earned her both praise and criticism. But that was her way, standing up for what she believed in, even when it wasn't popular. The city streets were relatively calm for a Thursday evening. She merged into traffic, automatically scanning her surroundings. Old habits died hard in this line of work. Streetlights flickered on as dusk settled in, casting long shadows across the familiar neighborhoods she'd sworn to protect. Her mind wandered to the community meeting scheduled for next week. There were tensions to address, concerns about over-policing in certain neighborhoods, questions about use of force policies. These were the conversations that mattered, the ones that could bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. She'd learned early in her career that real change happened through dialogue, not confrontation. At a red light, she checked her phone messages. Her sister had sent a reminder about Sunday dinner, a weekly tradition they'd maintained even through the busiest times. There was also a text from her daughter about her upcoming visit home from college. These small connections kept her grounded, reminded her of the world beyond the badge. As she drove, she passed the corner store where Mr. Washington, a local fixture for over 40 years, was closing up for the night. He waved as she passed. He'd known her since she was a rookie walking the beat. Back then, some community members had been skeptical of her, unsure whether to trust a black officer in a system that had often failed them. But over the years, she'd earned their respect through consistency, fairness, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The radio played softly in the background, an old soul station that reminded her of Sunday mornings in her grandmother's kitchen. The familiar melodies were interrupted by the occasional crackle of her personal police radio. She kept it on even off duty, Another habit formed over years of service. You never really stopped being a police officer, even when the uniform came off. She noticed a car ahead with a broken taillight and made a mental note not to ticket them, but to remind herself to mention the Fix-It Ticket program at the next community meeting. The initiative, which she'd helped implement, gave residents time to repair minor violations without facing immediate fines. It was small changes like these that helped build trust between police and the public. The city lights twinkled around her as she drove, each neighborhood telling its own story. She passed the high school where she occasionally gave talks about law enforcement careers, the community center where she'd helped establish a youth mentoring program, the park where she'd organized community police dialogues. Each location held memories of small victories and ongoing challenges in her mission to reform policing from within. Little did she know that in just a few minutes, everything she'd worked for, everything she believed in, would be put to the test in a way she never expected. The routine drive home was about to become anything but routine, and her response would challenge not only her own principles, but the very nature of police-community relations in her city. The evening air had grown cooler, and the streets were getting quieter. Captain Williams adjusted her air conditioning, completely unaware that she was about to become part of a story that would make headlines across the country, not for the reasons one might expect, but for what would happen next. The night had settled in completely now, with street lamps casting pools of yellow light on the quiet roads. Captain Williams was only about 10 minutes from home when she noticed the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her first thought wasn't alarm, it was professional curiosity. After all, she'd initiated countless traffic stops herself over the years. She did what any good officer would do, signaled, slowed down smoothly, and pulled over to a well-lit spot near a 24-hour convenience store. The dash camera would have a clear view, she thought automatically, always the police captain, even when she was the one being pulled over. She could see the store's security cameras too, and a few people were still milling about inside. Good witnesses if needed, another automatic assessment from years on the force. Through her side mirror, she watched two officers approach her vehicle. Their movements caught her trained eye. They were using a high-risk approach formation. That detail made her sit up straighter. Something wasn't right. These weren't routine traffic stop positions. These officers believed they were approaching a dangerous situation. Stay in the vehicle. Keep your hands where we can see them. The command came through clear and sharp. The voice was young, maybe too young. She recognized the slight tremor of adrenaline in it. She'd heard it countless times from rookie officers in tense situations. Captain Williams did exactly what she'd trained hundreds of officers to do in these situations. She kept her hands high on the steering wheel, clearly visible. "Officers," she called out calmly, "I'm Captain Williams from the 15th Precinct. My ID is in my front pocket, and I am carrying my service weapon." The response wasn't what she expected. "Exit the vehicle slowly. Hands up where we can see them." She could hear more sirens in the distance. Backup was already on the way. This wasn't a simple traffic stop. They were looking for someone, and somehow she fit the description. The irony wasn't lost on her. How many times had she reviewed body cam footage of similar situations, looking for ways to improve officer training? As she carefully opened her door, she continued speaking in clear, measured tones. "Officers, I'm going to step out slowly. I'm Captain Williams from the 15th Precinct. I'm one of you." The fluorescent lights from the convenience store cast harsh shadows across the scene. She could see people gathering at the store's windows now, phones raised to record what was happening. The two officers, she could see them clearly now, were young, probably fresh out of the academy. They were from the 23rd Precinct, according to their patches. That explained why they didn't recognize her. The 23rd was on the other side of the city, and these officers had probably never attended any of her training sessions. "Turn around. Hands behind your head." The commands kept coming. Captain Williams complied, her movements slow and deliberate. She taught these procedures herself, clear commands, clear compliance, no sudden movements. But standing there, hands behind her head, she was experiencing everything from the other side. She could hear the younger officer's partner radioing in their location and situation. More patrol cars were arriving, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. The convenience store's parking lot was becoming an unintended stage, with more spectators gathering at a safe distance. "Officers," she tried again, her voice steady, "if you check my left front pocket, you'll find my badge and ID. I'm Captain Williams, commanding officer of the 15th Precinct." She could feel the weight of her service weapon against her side, carefully concealed under her jacket. She knew the moment they spotted it could be dangerous if not handled correctly. One of the bystanders called out from the growing crowd, "That's Captain Williams. She's a police captain." But the officers, trained to focus on the situation at hand and not be distracted by crowd comments, maintained their positions. The sound of more vehicles arriving filled the air. Captain Williams remained perfectly still, her mind racing through years of training scenarios. She'd always emphasized the importance of listening to subjects who claimed to be law enforcement. There was a procedure for this, a way to verify credentials without escalating the situation. She could hear rapid footsteps approaching from behind. More officers probably responding to the backup call. The radio chatter had increased. She could make out fragments about a robbery suspect, a black SUV, a female driver. The pieces were falling into place in her mind. She matched a description, was in the right area, driving a similar vehicle. A new voice cut through the tension, older, more experienced. "Hold positions." The voice carried authority. Captain Williams recognized the tone of a veteran officer taking control of the scene. This was the moment where everything could either go very right or very wrong. The air was thick with tension. The crowd of onlookers had grown, their phones still recording. Captain Williams knew this scene would probably be all over social media within minutes. But right now, that wasn't her concern. Her focus was on maintaining calm and ensuring everyone, including the young officers behind her, made it through this situation safely. She could hear muffled conversations behind her, the rustle of papers being checked, radios crackling with updates. The veteran officer was doing his job, verifying information, checking credentials. This was protocol, this was procedure, this was what she helped write guidelines for. Time seemed to slow down. Each second stretched out as she stood there, hands still clasped behind her head, the cool night air settling around them. In her mind, she was already thinking about how this incident could be used for training. Every moment, every decision, every word spoken, it was all valuable learning material for improving police procedures. The lights from the patrol cars continued their rhythmic dance across the scene, creating moving shadows that played across the pavement. More voices joined the discussion behind her. She caught fragments of radio traffic, the sound of rapid typing on patrol car computers, the murmur of the gathering crowd. This was a moment of truth, not just for her, but for every officer present. How they handled the next few minutes would either reinforce or damage the community's trust in law enforcement. Captain Williams knew that whatever happened next would have ripple effects far beyond this parking lot. The next few moments unfolded like scenes from a training video Captain Williams had shown countless times at the academy. The difference was, this time she wasn't standing at the front of a classroom pointing out proper procedures, she was living them. "Ma'am, we've spotted what appears to be a weapon," one of the younger officers called out, his voice cracking slightly. Through years of experience, she could hear the mix of fear and adrenaline in his tone. The convenience store's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the scene, making everything feel more dramatic than it needed to be. "That's correct, officer," she responded, keeping her voice steady and professional. "As I mentioned, I'm carrying my service weapon. I'm Captain Williams from the 15th Precinct. If you'll allow me to slowly reach for my credentials—" "Don't move." The command came sharply from the second officer. Captain Williams froze, maintaining her position. Years of training told her this was the most critical moment. She knew these officers were following their training, but she also knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. The growing crowd at the convenience store had become restless. Someone shouted, "She's telling the truth. She's a police captain." More voices joined in, creating a chorus of protest. Captain Williams could feel the situation teetering on the edge of something worse. "Everyone, please stay back and remain calm." She projected her voice clearly, speaking both to the crowd and the officers. It was the same tone she used during tense community meetings, the voice that had helped her bridge gaps between law enforcement and the public countless times before. The sound of another vehicle approaching cut through the night air. Through the reflection in the store windows, she could see it was a supervisor's car. The cavalry was arriving, but the next few moments would be crucial. Officers, she tried again, her voice remaining professional despite the circumstances. I understand you're following procedure. I respect that. I've trained officers in these exact protocols. But right now, we need to de-escalate this situation. There are too many eyes on us, too many phones recording, and too much at stake. She could hear the shuffle of feet behind her as the supervisor approached. The night air had grown cooler, or maybe it was just the adrenaline making her more aware of everything. The buzz of the convenience store lights, the murmur of the crowd, the distant sound of city traffic continuing its endless flow. The supervisor's voice cut through the tension. What's the situation here? He sounded experienced, someone who had seen enough to know that things aren't always what they seem. Sir, one of the younger officers responded, vehicle matches the description from the robbery. Subject claims to be a police captain, but she's armed. I can see my credentials right through the car window, Captain Williams interjected calmly. Front seat, passenger side. Badge and ID are clearly visible. You can also call the 15th precinct. Officer Chen is still on duty. He saw me leave less than an hour ago. The mention of specific details seemed to shift something in the atmosphere. She could hear the supervisor moving toward her vehicle, the crunch of his boots on the asphalt. The crowd had grown quieter, as if everyone was holding their breath. Through the reflection in the store windows, she could see him peering into her car. The red and blue lights continued their rhythmic dance across the scene, creating moving shadows that made everything feel surreal. She thought about all the times she'd reviewed body camera footage of similar situations, always looking for teaching moments. Now she was creating one. Officers, the supervisor's voice had changed. There was recognition in it now, maybe even a hint of embarrassment. Lower your weapons. This is Captain Williams from the 15th. He moved quickly now, his footsteps approaching her position. Captain, I apologize. You can lower your hands. But Captain Williams didn't move yet. Sir, with respect, let's do this by the book. I've got a service weapon on my right side. I'd like everything documented properly. These officers were following their training, and I want this handled correctly. Her words seemed to have an impact on everyone present. The younger officers exchanged glances, their postures shifting slightly. The crowd had grown completely silent. Even the supervisor paused, seemingly impressed by her professionalism in the face of such a situation. Of course, Captain, he replied. What followed was a textbook example of proper procedure, the kind she'd taught but had never experienced from this side. The supervisor carefully approached, verified her weapon, secured it temporarily, and then retrieved her credentials. Every movement was deliberate, every action documented by the patrol car cameras and the dozens of phones still recording. As the situation began to resolve itself, Captain Williams remained acutely aware of every detail. The way the younger officers' hands shook slightly as they holstered their weapons, the relieved sighs from the crowd, the sound of radios crackling with updated information. Everything about this moment would be analyzed later, she knew, in briefing rooms, in training sessions, in community meetings. The supervisor was now making calls, his voice carrying across the parking lot as he contacted her precinct to double verify her identity. Standard procedure, even though he clearly recognized her now. The younger officers stood awkwardly to the side, their earlier confidence replaced by what looked like a mixture of embarrassment and concern. Captain Williams remained still, her mind already working through what would come next. This wasn't just an incident to be resolved, it was an opportunity. An opportunity to show how law enforcement should handle mistakes, how to turn a potentially disastrous situation into a teaching moment, and most importantly, how to bridge the gap between police and community in moments of crisis. The cold pavement pressed against Captain Williams' knees as she maintained her position. Despite the supervisor's recognition, she insisted on following proper procedure to the letter. Every second that passed felt like an hour, but she knew these moments would matter later, not just for her, but for every officer involved and everyone watching. Dispatch, be advised, the supervisor's voice carried across the parking lot. Identity confirmed. Subject is Captain Williams from the 15th precinct. The words hung in the night air, heavy with implications. Through the store window's reflection, she could see the younger officers shifting uncomfortably, their earlier confidence replaced by visible uncertainty. The crowd had grown larger, but differently now. The initial tension had transformed into something else, a sort of collective witnessing. Phones were still recording, but the angry shouts had been replaced by hushed conversations. Everyone seemed to sense they were watching something important unfold. "Captain," the supervisor approached carefully, "we've confirmed your identity with the 15th. Officer Chen vouched for you personally. We can proceed with removing the cuffs." His voice carried a mix of professional courtesy and genuine regret. "Thank you, Sergeant," she replied, her voice clear and steady. "But before we do that, I want to make sure we document everything properly. Body cameras still running?" She knew they were. She could see their red lights blinking. But she wanted everyone to hear her saying it. The younger officers stood nearby, their faces a mix of emotions that Captain Williams had seen many times before in her years of training recruits. Fear, embarrassment, uncertainty about what would happen next. One of them looked barely older than her own daughter. As the supervisor began the formal process of releasing her, Captain Williams took slow, deep breaths. The night air had grown colder, or maybe it was just the adrenaline wearing off. She could hear fragments of conversation from the crowd, some angry, some confused, but many seemed to be watching with interest to see how she would react. Captain," one of the young officers started, his voice shaky. "I don't know what to say. We just had a call about a robbery, and your vehicle matched the description." He trailed off, obviously struggling with the weight of what had just happened. The handcuffs clicked open, and Captain Williams slowly brought her hands forward, rubbing her wrists more out of habit than discomfort. She took a moment to straighten her jacket, a simple gesture that helped her gather her thoughts. The security cameras from the convenience store hummed quietly above, recording everything. "Officer," she said, turning to face the young man who had spoken, "what's your badge number?" The question made him stiffen, but she continued in a calm voice. "I'm not asking to report you. I want to know because this moment is going to be important for both of us." The parking lot had become eerily quiet. Even the usual city noises seemed muted, as if everything was pausing to watch what would happen next. The patrol car lights continued their silent dance across the scene, painting everyone in alternating shades of red and blue. "Badge number 8149, Captain," he responded, standing straighter despite his obvious nervousness. His partner, equally young, shifted his weight from foot to foot, badge number 8155 clearly visible on his uniform. Captain Williams nodded, committing the numbers to memory. She looked at both officers, taking in their youth, their training, their fear. 8 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet lot, "I was teaching at the academy about moments exactly like this one. About what happens when we make assumptions, when we move too quickly, when we forget to see the person behind the protocol." The supervisor had stepped back slightly, recognizing that something important was happening. The crowd had grown silent too, phones still recording, but people now straining to hear her words. "You both followed your training," she continued, looking at each officer in turn. "You responded to a call, identified a vehicle matching a description, and followed procedure. But somewhere along the way, something went wrong. Not just with this stop, but with the system that made it possible." She paused, letting her words sink in. A light breeze rustled through the trees lining the parking lot, carrying the distant sound of city life continuing beyond this moment. But here, in this space, time seemed to stand still. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice taking on the tone she used in training sessions, "we're all going to have choices to make. You'll have to write reports about this incident. People will watch these videos. Questions will be asked. But right now, in this moment, we have an opportunity." The younger officers stood transfixed, along with everyone else in the parking lot. Even the convenience store clerk had stepped outside, drawn by the gravity of the moment. Captain Williams could see her own reflection in the store windows, standing tall despite what had just happened, her badge now visible on her belt where the supervisor had returned it. "This doesn't have to be just another incident report," she continued. "This doesn't have to be another headline about what went wrong. This can be the moment where we start talking about what needs to change and how we can change it together." She could see understanding beginning to dawn on the young officers' faces. This wasn't going to be the career-ending mistake they had feared. Instead, it was becoming something else entirely. A teaching moment, a turning point, a chance for real change. The night air had grown still, as if the city itself was holding its breath. In the distance, more sirens could be heard, probably more supervisors responding to the initial call. But for now, in this moment, something important was happening in this convenience store parking lot, something that would have ripple effects far beyond this single incident. More patrol cars had arrived at the convenience store parking lot, their lights creating a kaleidoscope of red and blue against the night sky. Among them was a familiar face, Lieutenant Rodriguez from the 23rd Precinct, someone Captain Williams knew from Joint Task Force meetings. The moment he stepped out of his vehicle, his eyes widened with recognition. "Oh my God," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Captain Williams." The recognition in his voice carried across the parking lot, causing a ripple effect among the gathered officers. Those who hadn't known who she was suddenly straightened up, realization dawning on their faces. The lieutenant moved quickly through the crowd, his face a mixture of concern and embarrassment. "Captain, I just got the call. I came as soon as. I can't believe this happened." He turned to the two young officers, who looked like they wanted the ground to swallow them whole. Captain Williams raised her hand slightly, a gesture she used countless times to calm tense situations. "Lieutenant, let's handle this professionally." She noticed how her words made the young officer's shoulders relax slightly. They had been bracing for the worst. The convenience store's overhead lights hummed quietly as more people gathered. Store employees had come outside, customers had stopped to watch, and even cars were slowing down as they passed. Everyone seemed to sense that they were witnessing something significant. First, Captain Williams said, her voice carrying the authority that had earned her command of the 15th Precinct, "I want all body camera footage preserved." Not for complaints, she added, seeing the young officers tense up again, but because what happened here tonight needs to be remembered. Lieutenant Rodriguez nodded, already pulling out his phone to make the necessary calls. The crowd of spectators had grown quieter, phones still recording, but with a different energy now. This wasn't going to be another viral video of conflict, it was becoming something else entirely. "Officers," she turned to the two young policemen who had initiated the stop. "What made you think my vehicle was involved in the robbery?" Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was the same voice she used when teaching at the academy, encouraging officers to think through their actions. The taller of the two stepped forward slightly. "We got a call about a black SUV leaving the scene of a robbery on Pine Street. Female driver, heading east. Your vehicle matched the description, and when we ran the plates..." He hesitated. "When you ran the plates, what happened?" Captain Williams prompted gently. We didn't get a chance to fully run them," the second officer admitted, his face flushing. "Everything happened so fast. We saw the match with the vehicle description, and with the recent robberies in the area." Captain Williams nodded thoughtfully. The parking lot had grown quiet enough to hear the hum of the patrol car engines, the whispered conversations from the crowd, the distant sound of city traffic. A cool breeze rustled through nearby trees, carrying the scent of late-night food from the nearby diner. "You know what I noticed during this whole incident?" she asked, looking between the two officers. They shook their heads, uncertain. "I noticed that despite your mistake, you followed protocol. Your approach was textbook. Your commands were clear. You maintained control of the scene until a supervisor arrived." The young officers exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the response they had expected. Even Lieutenant Rodriguez looked surprised. But she continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone, "I'd also noticed something else. When I told you I was a police captain, what was your first thought? Be honest." The officers shifted uncomfortably. Finally, the shorter one spoke up. "Honestly, Captain, we thought you were just trying to talk your way out of the situation. We get a lot of people who claim to be law enforcement." "Exactly," Captain Williams nodded. "And that's what we need to talk about. Not just about tonight, but about all the assumptions we make. About how those assumptions can escalate situations that don't need to be escalated." She glanced around at the growing crowd of officers and spectators. Every face was focused on her, every ear straining to hear what she would say next. Even the convenience store's security cameras seemed to be tilting their mechanical heads to listen. "Lieutenant," she turned to Rodriguez, "I want these officers in my office tomorrow morning. Not for discipline," she added quickly, seeing his expression, "but for a conversation. A real conversation about what happened here, what we can learn from it, and how we can do better." The tension in the air began to shift. The young officers' faces showed the first hints of relief, mixed with something else. respect, perhaps, or understanding. The crowd of spectators had grown quiet, many lowering their phones, sensing that they were watching something unprecedented unfold. "And one more thing," Captain Williams added, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. "I want the robbery bulletin that came out tonight. Something tells me we need to have a department-wide conversation about how we describe suspects and vehicles. Because what happened here tonight? It's happened before, and it will happen again unless we change how we do things." The lieutenant was already making notes on his phone, nodding in agreement. The two young officers stood straighter, their earlier fear replaced by attention. Around them, other officers who had responded to the scene were listening intently, many making their own mental notes. Captain Williams looked around the parking lot one last time, taking in the scene that would undoubtedly be all over social media within hours. But maybe, just maybe, this time the story would be different. Maybe this time it would be about how a mistake became a moment of change, how a potential tragedy became a turning point. The next morning arrived with a crisp brightness that felt at odds with the heaviness of the previous night's events. Captain Williams arrived at the station earlier than usual, watching the sunrise paint the brick building in shades of gold. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night thinking about how to handle what came next. The precinct was quieter than usual this morning. Word had spread fast. It always did in law enforcement circles. As she walked through the lobby, she noticed officers and staff watching her with a mixture of concern and respect. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop since dawn with messages from fellow commanders, city officials, and even the police chief himself. "Captain," Officer Chen called out as she passed his desk. "Are you okay?" "I heard what happened." His voice trailed off, unsure how to continue. She gave him a reassuring nod. "I'm fine, Chen. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most important ones." She paused at his desk. "Have our visitors arrived yet?" "Yes, ma'am. They're waiting in the conference room. Been here since before I started my shift." The two young officers from last night had arrived almost an hour early. Through the conference room's glass walls, she could see them sitting stiffly in their chairs, still in uniform but looking somehow smaller than they had the night before. Their badges gleamed under the fluorescent lights, numbers 8149 and 8155. She'd remember those numbers for a long time. Captain Williams stopped by her office first, picking up a few things she'd prepared. A stack of incident reports from similar situations over the years, training materials she'd developed, and most importantly, a photo album she kept in her desk, one that told a story spanning decades of law enforcement history. When she entered the conference room, both officers jumped to their feet. "Captain," they said in unison, their voices tight with anxiety. She gestured for them to sit back down. "At ease, officers," she said, closing the door behind her. "This isn't a disciplinary hearing. This is a conversation that's been waiting to happen for a long time." She set her materials down on the table and took a seat across from them. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the conference room table. Outside, the city was waking up, unaware of the important conversation about to unfold in this quiet room. "Before we start," Captain Williams began, "I want you both to know something. What happened last night? I've been on both sides of that situation. When I was a rookie, not much older than you are now, I made similar assumptions. We all have." The officers exchanged glances, some of the tension leaving their shoulders. The younger one, whose nameplate read Officer Thompson, spoke first. "Captain, we've been up all night thinking about what we did wrong." "Good," she interrupted gently. "That's exactly where we need to start. Not with guilt, not with shame, but with understanding." She opened the photo album she'd brought, turning it to face them. Inside were photographs spanning decades, black and white images of the first African-American officers in their city, newspaper clippings about integration, training documents from different eras. Each page told part of a larger story. "This isn't just about last night," she explained, turning the pages slowly. "This is about patterns we've inherited, assumptions we've learned, and changes we need to make." She paused on a particular photo. A group of officers from the 1960s, standing proud despite the challenges they faced. The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of the building's heating system and the distant sounds of the precinct coming to life. Outside the conference room, officers went about their morning routine, some glancing curiously through the glass walls. "Tell me," Captain Williams said, leaning forward slightly, "what was going through your minds when you first saw my car last night? Not what the radio said, not what your training told you to do, but what you were actually thinking." The officers shifted in their seats. Finally, Officer Thompson's partner spoke up. "Honestly, Captain, we were scared. There had been 3 armed robberies in the area this month. When we saw a vehicle matching the description, and that's exactly what we need to talk about," she nodded. "Fear, assumptions, split-second decisions. But most importantly, we need to talk about what happens next, how we learn from these moments." She pulled out some of the incident reports she brought, similar situations from across the country, some with very different outcomes. Every one of these reports represents a moment where someone made a quick judgment. Sometimes they were right, sometimes they were wrong. But every time there was an opportunity to learn. The morning light had grown stronger, filling the room with warmth. Outside, the precinct was fully awake now, the familiar sounds of police work creating a backdrop to their conversation. But in this room, something special was happening. For the next hour, they talked, really talked, about implicit bias and how it affects everyone, not just in law enforcement, but in all walks of life. About the weight of the badge and the responsibility it carries. About the fine line between being cautious and being prejudiced. The officers shared their own experiences, their fears, their uncertainties. Captain Williams listened, really listened, offering guidance without judgment. She told them about her early days on the force, about mistakes she'd made and lessons she'd learned. "You know what impressed me most about last night?" she said as their conversation drew to a close. "It wasn't just that you followed procedure. It was that when you realized you were wrong, you were ready to learn. That's what makes a good officer great, the willingness to learn and grow." The transformation in the young officers was visible. The fear and shame they'd walked in with had been replaced by something else. Understanding, determination, and most importantly, hope. They weren't just 2 officers who had made a mistake anymore. They were part of something bigger, part of the change that needed to happen. 3 months had passed since that night in the convenience store parking lot. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the police academy's main lecture hall, where Captain Williams stood before a packed room of officers from every precinct in the city. The audience was a sea of blue uniforms, from fresh-faced recruits to seasoned veterans. "When I was wrongly stopped that night," she began, her voice carrying to the back of the room, "I had 2 choices. I could let it become another headline about what's wrong with policing, or I could make it into something that could change policing for the better." The room was silent except for the scratch of pens on notepads. In the front row sat the 2 officers from that night, no longer the nervous rookies they'd been, but more confident now, though humbled by experience. They'd become integral parts of the new training program that had emerged from that incident. "Today, we're going to do something different," Captain Williams continued, clicking to the next slide. "We're not just going to talk about procedures and protocols. We're going to talk about the human side of policing, about the split-second decisions we make, and how those decisions affect real people." The screen behind her showed dash cam footage from that night, but not just the tense moments. It showed the resolution, the conversation, the moment when a potential crisis became a catalyst for change. The footage had become a powerful teaching tool, not as an example of what went wrong, but as a demonstration of how to make things right. "Officer Thompson," she called out to one of the officers from that night, "would you share with everyone what you've learned in the past 3 months?" The young officer stood, turned to face his colleagues. His voice was steady now, confident in a way it hadn't been before. "That night changed how I approach every traffic stop, every interaction. It's not just about following procedure, it's about remembering that behind every call, every description, every situation, there are real people with real stories." The training program they developed together had already shown promising results. Complaints about traffic stops had dropped significantly. Community feedback was improving. Other departments had started requesting information about implementing similar programs. "But this isn't just about traffic stops," Captain Williams continued, moving through the room as she spoke. "This is about changing the culture of law enforcement from the inside out. It's about asking ourselves the hard questions before we make those split-second decisions." She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from the past 3 months, numbers that told a story of positive change. But more important than the numbers were the stories behind them. Stories of officers taking that extra moment to verify information, of improved community relations, of trust being rebuilt one interaction at a time. Look at the person next to you, she instructed the room. The shuffle of uniforms filled the air as officers turned to their colleagues. That person has their own stories, their own experiences, their own biases, just like you do, just like I do. Acknowledging that is the first step toward real change. The morning light had grown stronger, casting long shadows across the lecture hall. Outside, the sounds of the city provided a constant reminder of the community they served. Captain Williams moved to the center of the stage, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. "We've started something here," she said, gesturing to a wall where letters from community members were displayed. "These are thank you notes from citizens who've noticed the difference in how our officers interact with them. Real change, happening one interaction at a time." In the back of the room, she could see the police chief nodding approvingly. The program had gained support from the highest levels of the department, not just because it looked good on paper, but because it was producing real results. "Last week," she continued, "I got a call from a police department in another state. They'd heard about what we're doing here, about how we turned a potentially negative incident into a catalyst for positive change. They want to implement similar training." The room buzzed with energy now. Officers were leaned forward in their seats, engaged in a way that went beyond mere professional obligation. This wasn't just another mandatory training session, it was becoming a movement. "But here's what really matters," Captain Williams said, her voice softening slightly. "Last night, I was driving home from the precinct, just like I was 3 months ago. I saw a patrol car pull someone over. I stopped to watch, not because I was worried, but because I wanted to see our training in action." She smiled, remembering the scene. That officer approached the vehicle with respect, communicated clearly, and treated the driver like a person first, a suspect second. That's the change we're creating. That's the difference we're making. The morning had turned into afternoon, but nobody in the room seemed to notice the time passing. They were too engaged in the discussions that followed, too invested in the role-playing scenarios, too committed to being part of the solution. "We're not just changing procedures," Captain Williams concluded, looking out at the faces before her. "We're changing mindsets, we're changing hearts, and most importantly, we're changing the future of policing, one officer at a time." As the session ended and officers filed out of the room, many stopped to share their own stories, their own experiences, their own commitments to being part of the change. The 2 officers from that night stayed behind, helping to gather materials and prepare for the next session. "Captain," one of them said as they worked, "I never thought I'd say this, but that night was the best mistake I ever made, because it taught me how to be a better officer, a better person." Captain Williams nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, but inside this room, something extraordinary had taken root. A change that would ripple out into the community, one interaction, one officer, one moment at a time.